T-Tube News Today, March 2, 2022. Headlines. T-Tube is the voice for the voiceless. Subscribe, share and comment T-Tube, and be the voice for the voiceless. The Guardian come with reports today that patients are dying as conflict prevents supplies reaching Tigray hospitals. Medics unable to keep babies alive, says doctor, as Ethiopia's civil war creates desperate shortages of drugs, oxygen, fuel and food. Dr. Debretsion Michael, the president of the state of Tigray, also expressed his warning: if this blockade is continuing, half of the people of Tigray will die. Tigray had more than 10 million population before the genocidal war, although the corrupted Ethiopian officials minimized the number to 6 million as the extension of their deceptive way of harming Tigray.
Tigray is celebrating its memory of the victory of Adwa. Tigray, the home of heroes and heroines in the world, has defeated Italy, Turkey, Mahadist Sudan, Egypt, the Amhara invading Shiftas etc. many times, at the Battle of Sahadi, Gundet, Mekelle, Gari, Werhasiger, Medima, Machu, etc. Today it is celebrating Adwa victory over the Italian invasion. The Ethiopian corrupted state leaders have been covering themselves on the heroes of Tigray. Now, they found themselves naked. Ethiopians, especially the Amhara, have been busy on thefting the history of Tigray. Now, as they have defeated in the genocidal war, led by the genocider Abiy Ahmed Ali, they are ashamed of repeating their earlier shameful history. Menelik II was doing the same shameful history, betraying his county, concluding treaties with distinguished enemies of Ethiopia. As a result, he sold Eritrea to Italy, west part of Ethiopia to England and Djibouti to France. All the ancient and modern crisis of Ethiopia is resulted by the lazy man Menelik II. Now, his spiritual grand-grandson Abiy Ahmed Ali is committing genocide on the grand-grandchildren of the victory of Adwa.
The looted Tigrayan heritages and antiques are still being sold at eBay, American online selling company. Last week we aired that some of the antiques have been removed from the page, but now there are some other new antiques added. The international community has to prohibit such shameful acts of eBay.
The African dictator, Isayas Afewerki, has been killing his people at home and now following them in refugee shelter camps. What is the world waiting for to hear from the butcher, Isayas Afewerki, we want to ask.
What is Africa's position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, while it supported Tigray genocide in Ethiopia?
The Guardian come with reports today that patients are dying as conflict prevents supplies reaching Tigray hospitals. Medics unable to keep babies alive, says doctor, as Ethiopia's civil war creates desperate shortages of drugs, oxygen, fuel and food. Dr. Debretsion Michael, the president of the state of Tigray, also expressed his warning: if this blockade is continuing, half of the people of Tigray will die. Tigray had more than 10 million population before the genocidal war, although the corrupted Ethiopian officials minimized the number to 6 million as the extension of their deceptive way of harming Tigray. People in Tigray are dying due to a lack of oxygen and medicines, a doctor at the region's largest hospital has said, as medics struggle to care for the sick amid frequent electricity blackouts and fuel shortages. As the 16-month conflict between Tigrayan forces and Ethiopian government forces drags on, the isolated northern region of 10 million people continues to suffer under what the UN has called a de facto blockade. Staff at the Afar Referral Hospital in Mekelle, the regional capital, said they were losing patients who would have otherwise lived. Patients die. Every day we hear about patients dying because of a lack of oxygen, a lack of this drug, that drug, the doctor, who could not be named for security reasons, told The Guardian. Speaking during a rare moment of internet connectivity, he said the wider region was suffering similar problems. That morning, he said, doctors from the northern town of Adwa had told him their hospital, which had survived looting and destruction during the early months of the war, was now struggling to keep infants alive. They said, patients are dying because of a lack of oxygen, a lack of electricity, and they cannot keep the babies breathing. The machines are failing. So they were asking for help, but we told them we cannot do anything, he said. The World Health Organization has said that, from July until last month, it had been unable to get medical supplies into Tigray, and although some have trickled in, doctors and aid workers said they were nowhere near enough to meet the needs of a population deprived of essentials for months.
The Ethiopian government, led by the butcher and cruel Abiy Ahmed, has rejected the UN's assertion that it has in effect blockaded Tigray. It said military offensives by the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF), most recently in northern Afar, had blocked delivery routes. The government of Abiy Ahmed, Ethiopia's prime minister, has also accused TPLF fighters so many false allegations to hide his crimes. The TPLF has previously denied any allegations. However, it is civilians who are suffering. A 500-bed hospital staff are desperate for many of the most basic medical supplies, including gauze, intravenous fluids and linen cleaning agents. Despite deliveries by the International Committee of the Red Cross in January and February, the organization's first since September, doctors are still reusing gloves for everything except surgery and childbirth, the source said. The region's chronic lack of fuel, no humanitarian agency has been allowed to bring in any since August, apart from 2 fuel trucks in November, is taking its toll on the hospital. One major headache has been that the diesel generator used during power cuts requires about 2,000 liters of fuel to run for 24 hours. That has become impossible, said the doctor. So we're trying to use very small generators that can use a small amount of fuel, and even that is becoming a real problem. So again, downsizing the service day by day, that's what we've been doing. The WHO said the lack of fuel had hampered its efforts to distribute supplies, the first it had been permitted to deliver to Tigray since July. About 33.5 tons of medical stocks have been airlifted into Mekelle in recent days, but most remain in storage because there is no fuel to transport them. Staff at Ader said they had sent their own lorry to pick up their share of the supplies on Monday. Advertisement. The doctor and his colleagues have many worries, but chief among them is the fate of their cancer patients, as the hospital has worked its way through even the last stocks of expired chemotherapy drugs and there are none left. Cancer patients are really suffering, the doctor said. We ask them to wait, and they keep on coming back, especially now. Some drugs are coming to Mekelle and almost everyone ran to the hospital asking if their drugs arrived. But again, to their disappointment, we told them we have no change at all.
With no more diagnostic tests in the hospital, the doctor said he was also concerned for people with HIV/AIDS. Particularly children. We cannot make a diagnosis of HIV in children. So care is significantly compromised, he said. Without treatment, up to half of infants infected with HIV die within their first 2 years. The Ader is believed to be the only place in Tigray that still has antiretroviral drugs, but its stock would only last a month, possibly less, the doctor said. The hospital has seen a big increase in children suffering from severe acute malnutrition, with admissions in the past 7 months tripling compared with pre-war levels, according to hospital data. Of 208 children admitted since July, 21 had died, a second doctor at Ader said. Staff fear that the situation in rural Tigray is even worse. In January, the UN World Food Programme warned that at least 2 million people in Tigray were suffering from an extreme lack of food. What's peculiar about the malnutrition that we're seeing nowadays is that previously this was from poor families, the doctor said. But now even those living in bigger cities like ours, and who used to have reliable monthly income, are now having problems with banking because people cannot withdraw the money that they have deposited in both the government and private banks. He realized how widespread the problem had become, he said, when several of Ader's doctors brought their own children in to be treated. That really broke our heart, he said. We never thought we would see this. Aside from the struggles of their patients, the hospital's 2,000-strong staff have their own problems. They have not been paid, they said, since May. Ader's staff hope that, amid the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the international community will not forget about Tigray. There are lots of issues for the world, of course, but we are members of the human community, the doctor said. We hope some people somewhere will care about our story. The international community is duty-bound to enforce international law and make the genocide's criminals liable. There should be an independent investigation and effective punishments of the invaders and genociders against the people of Tigray.
What is Africa's position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine? At a time, it is silent on Tigray genocide in Africa's Tigray, Ethiopia. The African Union has called on Russia to respect international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. In a statement on February 24, Chair Macky Sall and Commission Chair Moussa Faki called on Russia and Ukraine to establish a ceasefire and open political negotiations to preserve the world from the consequences of planetary conflict. It is a paradox. Kenya, Gabon, and Ghana spoke out against the escalating conflict at an emergency meeting for the United Nations Security Council on February 21, but most African countries have remained quiet. South Africa on February 23 asked Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine and called for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The USSR's history in post-colonial Africa. While Russia's influence on the continent has been slowly rising in the recent past, it pales in comparison to the USSR's in post-colonial Africa from the 1950s to the 1970s. Seen as an alternative to Western imperialism and capitalism, some post-colonial African leaders aligned themselves with the USSR with adopted ideologies ranging from socialism to Marxism-Leninism. Several African countries, including Algeria, Guinea, Ethiopia, South Africa, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo (DRC), received financial and sometimes military support from the USSR during their own independence struggles. Revered African statesmen, including the first president of the DRC, Patrice Lumumba, and Burkina Faso's Thomas Sankara, also adhered to socialist ideologies emerging from the USSR. Russia and modern-day Africa. Russia has in recent years been rebuilding and strengthening its relations with African countries through trade, aid, and security, most notably through the Wagner Group. The private group is reportedly aligned with the Kremlin and has been helping Mali and the Central African Republic fight insurgencies, much to the chagrin of France, which is falling out of favor with several former colonies. Thousands of Africans, meanwhile, study in Ukrainian universities, mostly from Morocco, Nigeria, and Egypt. What a paradox. Africa is a tragic continent, said PLO Lumumba once at the third Anti-Corruption Day. Africa is unlucky, he added. He was right, there is no responsible leader in Africa, there is no man, there are impiety-minded dictators who pretend to look like leaders and for the continuation of foreign aid. At a time there is active genocide in Ethiopia, Tigray, committed by collective of world dictators like China, Russia, Eritrea, UAE, Somalia, Ukraine, Turkey etc. African Union and African leaders have supported the genocide and remain silent for 16 months-long human rights violations and genocide. Now, the corrupted man Moussa Faki and other irresponsible African leaders are pretending to be concerned on Ukraine-Russian war, hiding their crimes and criminal leaders at home. Yes, Africa is tragic continent. And African Union is the union of dictators. Tigray needs eyes of the international community. Tigray genocide is the world's worst genocide.
Here is the statement of the corrupted man Moussa Faki as it is. Statement from Chair of the African Union, HE President Macky Sall and Chairperson of the O Commission HE Moussa Faki Mohammed, on the situation in Ukraine, the 24th of February 2022, Addis Ababa. The current Chair of the African Union and President of Senegal, President Macky Sall, and the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki Mohammed, expressed their extreme concern at the very serious and dangerous situation created in Ukraine. They call on the Russian Federation and any other region or international actor to imperatively respect international law, the territorial integrity and national sovereignty of Ukraine. The Chair of the African Union and the Chairperson of the African Union Commission urge the two parties to establish an immediate ceasefire and to open political negotiations without delay, under the auspices of the United Nations, in order to preserve the world from the consequences of planetary conflict, and in the interests of peace and stability in international relations in service of all the peoples of the world. Shameful statement from a shameless man.
Unprecedented attacks hound Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. The scene has become all too common during Ethiopia's drawn-out war. Thousands of Eritrean refugees, shell-shocked and separated from loved ones, fleeing on foot through harsh terrain to escape artillery and gunfire. It played out again this month, after the Bahr el refugee camp in the northeastern Afar region sustained what survivors described as a brazen assault by rebels from neighboring Tigray. At least 5 people were killed and an untold number of women kidnapped. Those lucky enough to escape are now scattered across Afar, awaiting an uncertain future in a country they once saw as a haven from their repressive homeland. The attack marked the first time Eritrean refugees were targeted outside Tigray, where the war began, and was the first such assault on Eritrean refugees belonging to the ethnic Afar minority. Yet in other respects, the incident followed a familiar pattern, one analysts say highlights failings of the Ethiopian government, the rebels and the international community at large. It has also renewed debate on how to accommodate one of the most vulnerable groups in Africa's second most populous country. "I just can't emphasize enough how unprecedented this is," said Sarah Miller, senior fellow with Refugees International, highlighting the scale and scope of abuses against Eritreans during every stage of the 15-month war. Ethiopia is no longer a safe place for Eritrean refugees, neither it for Tigrayans. That's quite clear. War crimes. Eritrean refugees have a long history in northern Ethiopia, first arriving in 2000 towards the end of a 2-year border war that killed tens of thousands. Before the current conflict broke out, some 113,000 Eritrean refugees were registered in Tigray and Afar, according to the UN. Most were fleeing the authoritarian rule of President Isayas Afewerki. Early in the conflict, refugees at 2 camps near the border faced abuses, including killings, rapes and looting, at the hands of Eritrean soldiers that Human Rights Watch has termed evident war crimes. Those 2 camps were ultimately destroyed in what one aid group called a rampage, after the area came under Eritrean control. Thousands remain missing. Last July, fighting reached 2 other camps farther south in Tigray. Since then, refugees there have faced extended cuts to food and medical aid, and 3 were killed in a drone strike in January. Looting, kidnapping. The attack on the Bahrail camp began February 3, part of a broader offensive in Afar that diplomats say represents the latest setback to hope for peace talks. Heavy weapons were thrown into the refugee camp and Tigray forces controlled the area. The same day they started looting property, recalled one survivor, according to testimony collected by an aid agency and shared with AFP.
The Ethiopian and Eritrean troops kidnapped some refugee women. "We do not know where they are," said the woman, who became separated from her sister and 9-year-old son. Hundreds of Bahrail refugees have sought shelter at the Agda Hotel in Afar's capital Samara, gathering under cardboard boxes or spindly trees in the courtyard to shield themselves from the sun. "For 3 days we had no kind of food or water, but because of our fear we weren't thinking about that at all," Abdu Ahmed told AFP. Abiy Ahmed Ali is known for his lies. The answer is Abiy should have to open all media communications and let the people themselves say who abused them. No one in their corner. Of 34,000 refugees registered in and around Bahrail, fewer than half, 14,250, have been accounted for, UN Refugee Agency spokesman Neven Cervenkovich told AFP last week. But attempts to establish new sites elsewhere in the country have moved slowly. Refugees told AFP they were heartbroken about having to flee Bahrail but resigned to their circumstances. "If God took my family and my home from me, I don't have anyone to ask about it. I will accept it," said Halima Kedir, who has located just one of her 8 children since the attack. For Miller, from Refugees International, the Eritreans' plight highlights broader failures to protect civilians during a war that has killed thousands and, according to the UN and the US, driven hundreds of thousands to the brink of starvation. The humanitarian community has a lot of reckoning and deep thinking to do around what's been going on in Ethiopia, she said. "We have a special duty to Eritrean refugees, who have no one in their corner, who have no one protecting them." The African dictator, Isayas Afewerki, have been killing his people at home and now, following them in refugee shelter camps. What is the world waiting for to hear from the butcher, Isayas Afewerki, we want to ask. The African Union is less effective at 20 than it was at 2, its enforcement of democratic norms is slipping. The Economist, February 12, 2022 edition. It was a birthday commemorated in style. In the heart of Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, the seat of the African Union, water fountains erupted and champagne glasses clinked as heads of state and assorted dignitaries tucked into a 4-course meal to the sound of sultry jazz. The party marked 20 years since the O's founding. It coincided with the O's annual summit, which took place on February 5 and 6. Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, seized the opportunity to thank his fellow African leaders. They had stood by his government through a challenging year, he said, confirming the principle of African solidarity upon which the O was built. It was a veiled reference to his country's civil war, which continues to rage a few hundred kilometers from the city. Neither he nor the other leaders made any mention of his tactics, which include starving into submission the 10 meters people of Tigray, or independent regional state. Now, Abiy is committing genocide, ethnic cleansing, gang rape, looting and complete destruction using drones. That would have ruined the festive mood, yet it is such horrors that keep thoughtful African officials up at night. The O, which replaced its discredited predecessor, the Organization of African Unity (OAU), in 2002, is supposed to resolve the continent's wars, ease the flow of trade across its borders and help Africa to speak with one voice in world affairs. Thabo Mbeki, a former president of South Africa and one of the O's architects, promised a continent of democracy, in which the people participate and the rule of law is upheld. 2 decades on, its record is mixed. The African Continental Free Trade Area, which took effect last year, is a genuine, if incomplete, achievement. So too are some of the O's early efforts at peacekeeping and upholding democracy. Unlike the OAU, which refused to interfere in the affairs of its members, the O has the power to intervene, without consent, to stop a bloodbath. In 2004 it sent African troops into Darfur to halt a genocide. 3 years later it established a mission to combat a jihadist insurgency in Somalia. And for almost 2 decades putches had become much rarer, thanks in part to the O's strict no-coups policy. In other respects though, the O has come to resemble the talking shop it supplanted. At each summit it approves admirable-sounding schemes. Too few go anywhere. In 2017 Paul Kagame, Rwanda's president and soon-to-be chairman of the O, spoke of a crisis of implementation. According to Bruce Byers of the European Centre for Development Policy Management, a think tank, the gap between the number of continental initiatives and their entry into force has widened over time. Mr. Kagame warned of a dysfunctional organization in which member states see limited value, and our citizens have no trust. According to Afrobarometer, a polling firm, more than a third of Africans either think the O is useless or have no opinion of it at all. The O's ambition to end conflict on the continent, originally by 2020, now pushed back to 2030, has rarely seemed more daunting. In addition to the war in Ethiopia, jihadists still run amok across large parts of Somalia and much of the Sahel. Mozambique is struggling to quell a bloody insurgency in its impoverished north. Eastern Congo seethes with rebel militias. Coups are also making a comeback. In the past year the O has suspended 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali and Sudan, because of putches. Solomon Durso of Amani, a think tank in Addis Ababa, frets that there has been a puncturing of the democratic norms that the O had been trying to enforce. Others lament inaction. The O's Peace and Security Council, a 15-member panel modelled on the UN Security Council, has lost some of its energy and zeal, says a former OO official. It chose not to expel Chad when the son of Idriss Déby, Chad's late dictator, seized power after his father's death last year. The O said the takeover was not a coup. Pragmatism as well as diplomatic sensitivities partly explain this. Chad's army plays an important role fighting jihadists in the Sahel, and Moussa Faki, a former Chadian foreign minister, is currently chairman of the O's Commission, its executive arm. Nonetheless, this will constitute a precedent, warns Mohamed Diatta of the Institute of Security Studies, another think tank in Addis Ababa. The Commission's dream of becoming something like the executive branch of the European Union has faded. Unlike the European Commission, it has no meaningful powers to enforce treaties or craft regulations. It might be called a commission, but it is becoming more like a secretariat, says a Western diplomat. Game of Thrones Paul Williams, an academic at George Washington University who has studied the O, argues that African governments have also learned how to game it. At first the Commission ran the show, and a lot of the member states didn't know how to push back, he says. But as they have gained expertise and knowledge, they have begun to exert themselves much more forcefully. Ethiopia is a prime example. For more than a year it has kiboshed a strong O response to its civil war. All mediators dispatched at the outset of the conflict were soon rebuffed. It took almost another year for the Peace and Security Council to meet expressly to discuss the crisis. The fact that rebels were then threatening to storm Addis Ababa no doubt focused minds. Another mediation effort was established in August. It is led by Olusegun Obasanjo, a former Nigerian president who, happily for Abiy, chaired the electoral observation mission that endorsed Ethiopia's questionable polls last year. Almost 6 months into the job, Mr. Obasanjo is only now hiring staff. Even if it were more willing to be firm, Theo has little by way of sticks or carrots to enforce its decisions. Countries, big or small, can thumb their nose at it. When the Peace and Security Council voted to send troops to quell violence in Burundi in 2015, the Burundians basically told him to bugger off, says Mr. Williams. Few are better at this than Ethiopia. Its government can lean on diplomats who displease it, or expel them altogether. But Mr. Afewerki, in a candid address on February 5, warned that cries of sovereignty were being used by African states as an iron wall against any intervention, and that expressions of solidarity were no substitute for action when neighboring houses are set ablaze. It was a tacit admission that the task of building a union greater than the sum of its parts remains unfinished. Now, the African Union is giving protection for dictators and dictatorship. The world has to condone this irresponsible union.
Battle of Adwa. Tigrayan army uses envelopment, frontal attack to annihilate Italian forces. On the 1st of March 1896, in the vicinity of the Ethiopian town of Adwa, a local army led by Emperor Menelik, also known as Menelik II, cut a colonialist Italian army to pieces. At this time Menelik was hiding himself while Tigrayans defeating Italians. Historians consider the Battle of Adwa, culmination point of the Italo-Ethiopian War 1895–1896, to be one of the most important events in the world. In fact, it was not the first victory of an African nation against a European counterpart since Hannibal's successful battles against Rome during the Second Punic War 2,200 years ago. Tigrayans made 10 victories before this time. In the introduction to their book The Battle of Adwa, Reflections on Ethiopia's History Against European Colonialism, editors Paulos Milkias and Getachew Metaferia wrote, Adwa holds a significant place in Africa's history. It challenges the demeaning Western conception of African cultures. It demonstrates that being targeted for colonization is not a prelude to fatality and that colonialism can be defeated. Beyond those historical, sociological, and geostrategic considerations lies a deep tactical lesson. Conducting a spoiling attack, the Tigrayan army made successful use of two forms of maneuver, envelopment and frontal attack, to annihilate an Italian brigade led by MG Matteo Albertone. A look into the genesis of the Italo-Ethiopian War allows the assertion that the roots of the Battle of Adwa lie, at least down to the triangular relations between Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia, who was politically based in Tigray, King Menelik II of Shoa, who was known for being ambitious and ingenious, and the Italian government, which wanted to colonize Ethiopia. During the second half of the 19th century, the Horn of Africa experienced a period of turmoil punctuated by significant events including internal and external battles, alliances and betrayals, friendship treaties and commerce treaties. Before and during this period, European nations like Germany, France, Great Britain, and newcomer Italy were eagerly willing to carve their empires throughout the African continent. This feverish imperialist obstinacy, also known as the Scramble for Africa, reached its climax at the Berlin Conference 1884–1885. It was obvious that the Horn of Africa and the adjacent Suez Canal, opened in 1869, constituted a great strategic interest, and it logically triggered the European imperialist nations' desires. Guided only by the principle of divide et impera, divide and conquer, they established contacts and relationships with many local chiefs and kings through a multitude of treaties. The main consequences of these Machiavellian politics, chiefly based on the provision of armament to their local, temporary or long-term allies, were the modernized weapons proliferation and the constant destabilization of the Ethiopian Empire. One of the major treaties that set the guns firing of the Italo-Ethiopian War was the Treaty of Juaque, or Uchali, as the Italians spelled it. Its primary goal was to secure Italian possessions in eastern Africa, Eritrea. Concluded on 2 May 1889 by the intermediary of Count Pietro Antonielli, in his dual role of official envoy of the Italian government and close friend of Emperor Menelik II, the Italy-Ethiopia Treaty of Friendship and Commerce of Juaque had been established in a dual language, Amharic and Italian, version. Owing to the light linguistic discrepancy induced by or due to simple diplomatic chicaneries, this agreement failed to be read like a typical non-capitulationist international document willingly entered into by two sovereign polities mutually seeking to normalize and enhance positive relations for present and future generations and regimes, according to Isayas chapter, Adwa 1896, who was civilized and who was savage, that appeared in the Battle of Adwa. The main dispute rose over the interpretation of one of the treaty's articles, which stated that the Ethiopian king would involve the Italian government in matters dealing with other powers or governments. As the months went by, the Italians read the article as Ethiopia being their protectorate and notified the other European powers. Menelik too refused point-blank to admit to any kind of subjugation. He argued that his agreement to use the Italian government as a middleman was supposed to be if he so desired and not that he would be obligated to do so. This contradiction was the proximate cause of the Italo-Ethiopian War. During 1895 and 1896, the conflict moved from skirmishes to bloody battles, interspersed by many attempts to settle the dispute, and finally reached its culmination point at the Battle of Adwa on the 29th of February 1896. After failing to lure the Ethiopian forces to attack his entrenched positions around Mount Endicho in Tigray, the Ethiopians' most probable course of action, LTG Orest Baratari, gave orders to his 20,000 Italian and native troops to conduct what was supposed to be a surprise attack on the Ethiopian troops massed in the vicinity of Adwa. For this mission, Baratari's troops were arrayed in 4 brigades, each commanded by an Italian army general. With a fighting power of 17,700 effective fighters, the Italians had 14,519 rifles, 56 artillery guns, and no cavalry, according to George Fitzhardinge Berkeley in his book The Campaign of Adwa and the Rise of Menelik. In the center of their disposition was MG Giuseppe Aramondi occupying Mount Bela, and at his rear, at Rebi Ariani, was the reserve brigade, commanded by MG Giuseppe Elena. MG Vittorio da Guarmita, with his brigade, was occupying the spur of Mount Bela at the right of the mount itself. MG Matteo Albertone had to move and occupy the left flank of the Italian front by arraying his brigade on the mountains of Cadane Merit. This last brigade, equipped with 3.5 batteries of mountain artillery, 14 guns, was made of 4 native battalions plus the irregulars of Okule Kusai and Geralta, for a total of 4,092 soldiers, wrote Berkeley. Here is the big lies. In an impressive display of national unity, a 100,000-strong army composed of contingents from almost every region and ethnic group of the Ethiopian Empire was eagerly awaiting the Italians. However, the Ethiopian army was invading Tigrayans, useless army for Tigrayans because the Ethiopian army was a burden, raping, and moving in search of food. Faced with the Italian plan, the Ethiopian Imperial Army had a coherent organization, notwithstanding the sarcastic opinion of British historian Berkeley, who described it as a feudal army, with hardly an attempt at modern organization. The arms in the hands of the Ethiopians were modern, but the organization was, in many respects, very similar to that of the English at the Battle of Agincourt. Ony the Tigrayan women and men were functional. In their defensive positions, the Ethiopian formation near Adwa resembled a cross to enable it to respond in the same manner no matter from which side the enemy's attack came. According to Milkias in his chapter, The Battle of Adwa, the historic victory of Ethiopia over European colonialism. The fighters, arrayed in a defensive position, were equipped with 40 cannons, 70,000 rifles ranging from Remingtons to Martini Henrys, Fusel-Gras, Burdens, Mausers, Labels, and Vitterlis, as well as spears and swords. Emperor Menelik and his 35,000-strong imperial bodyguard and Empress Tetu with her 5,000 combatants were encamped at the monastery of Fermona in the center of the imperial army disposition. The Ethiopian main body was arrayed from the south of the Shaloda Massif, also known as Mount Salado, to the Mariam Massif. When combined, the Tigrayan army numbered around 15,000 fighters, led by the charismatic and great nationalist Rasulullah. This is the enemy. Albertone's brigade was recklessly and blindly moving up in his attempt to reach his assigned position, according to Berkeley. By dawn on the 1st of March, at the end of the 3 columns approach toward the Ethiopian defensive positions, the Negus Negusti army conducted a spoiling attack which caught the Italians off guard. The Tigrayan army engaged the forward element of Albertone's brigade from the heights of Mariam Massif at 6 a.m. In reaction to this contact, the Italians' artillery fired on the Ethiopian formations, which were massed within the cannon's range. This caused many casualties. The Ethiopian troops scattered and attacked in smaller formations. Using their traditional half-moon formation, Rasulullah's and Ras Mangesh's infantries pressed the leading Italian forces while the 2 wings, supported by Ras Michael's Wallo cavalry, achieved an envelopment of the opponents. The 1st Battalion of Albertone's brigade was quickly surrounded and destroyed. Some Ethiopians, led by Dejaz Makbalcha Abba Nefso, the hero of Adwa, deployed their quick-firing guns on the lower side of Mount Abagarima, setting an effective support by Firi. This allowed Rasulullah and Ras Mangesh's Tigrayan fighters to finish crushing the remainder of Albertone's brigade by swift movements associated with a deluge of rifles firing, spears hurling, swords swirling, and hand-to-hand combat. They captured 14 artillery guns and destroyed the 3 other battalions. The annihilation of Albertone's brigade was complete. In an attempt to assist his endangered left wing, Eritrea ordered his right wing to move up and link up with Albertone. After maneuvering for hours and despite one of Veramondi's battalions offering him an effective support by fire, Dabormida was unable to meet his commander's expectations due to the massive Tigrayan forces isolating Albertone's brigade. As soon as the Italians' right flank was destroyed, the Tigrayan troops oriented their efforts toward the main body. They then decisively engaged Veramondi's brigade and successfully seized objectives in the rear of Velena's reserve brigade. In fact, the Tigrayan army's intent was to seal off the whole Italian army and prevent it from withdrawing Duentecho, Adigrat, and Akele Guze. One by one, all of the Italian brigades were destroyed. Dabormida's brigade was the last to face the Furia Ethiopiana. Around 6 p.m., only the remnants of the 4 Italian brigades succeeded in withdrawing from the battlefield in a manner far from being orderly. Just before the Ethiopian forces declared victory, Eritrea fled the battlefield. The commander of the Italian army was later brought to trial by the Italian government for having abandoned his command from 12:30 p.m. on the 1st of March until 9 a.m. on the 3rd of March, i.e. during the retreat, and having thus omitted to give orders, or take measures, such as the circumstances required, according to Berkeley. There are many historical accounts of the battle's toll. According to 2 of the most reliable, around 6,500 Italian soldiers were killed wounded and 2,500 taken prisoner for the first, and 7,560 were killed wounded and 1,865 taken prisoner for the second. Meanwhile, the Ethiopians suffered almost 7,000 killed and 10,000 wounded. As a result of this bloody battle, Italy recognized the independence of Ethiopia and revised her East Africa extension plans. A close look at the role played by the Tigrayan component of the Ethiopian army gives a clear insight to how the Ethiopians used the 2 forms of maneuver, envelopment and frontal attack, to destroy Albertone's brigade. As a reminder, the Ethiopian offensive was overall a typical spoiling attack. According to the FM 3-0 operations, offensive operations are conducted to defeat and destroy enemy forces and seize terrain. They can be launched from defensive positions. There are 4 types of offensive operations: movement to contact, attack, pursuit, and exploitation. An attack, hasty or deliberate, can have a special purpose. The 6 doctrinal special purpose attacks are: ambush, spoiling attack, counterattack, raid, feint, and demonstration. FM 102, Operational Terms and Graphics, defines spoiling attack as a tactical maneuver employed to seriously impair a hostile attack while the enemy is in the process of forming or assembling for an attack. This clearly validates the spoiling nature of the attack launched by the Ethiopian army on a poorly deployed enemy in the early hours of the 1st of March 1896, with the Tigrayan army being the first to engage the Italians. Many accounts established the decided doctrinal inclination of the Ethiopian Imperial Army towards a specific form of pincer movement. They called it Afena and achieved it from a half-moon formation during their offensive operations. According to Milkias, when they encounter a battalion or large body of an invading army, they employed Afena, the poor man's blitzkrieg. In Afena, the Ethiopian fighters surrounded the enemy and advanced towards the center, using whatever cover was available for them. Encirclement was conducted with Fitorary's troops dividing into 2 and making a detour around the flanks of the invaders. The army would then go to direct attack from every side. There are 5 doctrinal forms of maneuver: turning movement, penetration, infiltration, envelopment, and frontal attack. Only the 2 latter apply to this case study. The term envelopment is defined as a form of maneuver in which an attacking force seeks to avoid the principal enemy defenses by seizing objectives to the enemy rear to destroy the enemy in its current positions. At the tactical level, envelopments focus on seizing terrain, destroying specific enemy forces, and interdicting enemy withdrawal routes. FM 102. By using Afena, the Tigrayan army and the support of Ethiopian forces succeeded in destroying each and every battalion of Albertone's brigade. The lateral movement of Ras Alula's and Ras Mangesh's fighters associated with a withdrawal denial establishes a strong and obvious link between the Ethiopian Afena and a classic and doctrinal envelopment. The slight discrepancy is that the Afena commanded to use a divertive force in the central portion of the half-moon formation instead of avoiding the principal enemy defenses. This diversion was critical to allowing the lateral elements, mainly the cavalry, to slide and encircle the enemy, and crush his flanks, and in fact, this associated maneuver, in light of modern war theory, is a frontal attack. As stated in the FM 3-90 tactics, a frontal attack is a form of maneuver in which an attacking force seeks to destroy weaker enemy force or fix a larger enemy force in place over a broad front. Given the ratio of forces, more than 15,000 Ethiopians versus 4,092 Italians, the Tigrayan army used its overwhelming combat power to strike directly his weaker enemy in his positions, prior to the envelopment achievement. All in all, the Ethiopians' form of maneuver called Afena, a variant of pincer movement, was effective and decisive in the overwhelming and glorious victory achieved by Ras Alula and the Tigray troops at the Battle of Adwa. By applying this subtle combination of two forms of maneuver, envelopment and frontal attack, the Tigrayan army led by Ras Alula annihilated Albertone's brigade and called for further destruction of the Italian army. This resounding success propelled the Ethiopian Empire into the League of Independent Nations and later served as a compass for many anti-colonialists and Pan-Africanists in the quest to their identity. Tigrayans faced two invaders, the useless Ethiopians and the foregoing invaders. Source: Infantry Magazine, November to December 2011, Volume 100, Number 5. Every time in history until today, Tigrayans make victory, the Amhara corrupts, and theft victory, Tigrayans construct country, the Shoa and Amhara destroy it. See the current incident, the case of Grand Renaissance Dam.